All right, well, thank you, thank you. Hey, can we give it up one more time for our keynote speakers? We've had some awesome keynotes at this conference. I really like them this year. All right, so I'm going to take some time to talk about reverse engineering or dissecting proprietary protocols today. So hopefully you enjoy this. And I'll start with the obligatory who am I slide. Who's the crazy guy standing up in front of you talking today? I've been in the cybersecurity industry in offensive operations or hacking for around 15 years, which is a little scary to say out loud. And as Steve mentioned, I'm super excited that I'm releasing a new SANS Core Security 568 this year, which is focused on product security testing. And product security testing has a wide range of application within cybersecurity, but it also has an application to supply chain attacks. So we called it Combating Supply Chain Attack with Product Security Testing. If the talk that I give today interests you, you should totally check out that class because we have a lot more of this content in that class. During the day to pay the bills, I work for SonicWall. I lead their threat research team there, staying on top of recent threats and adding protection. And on almost any social media platform, you can catch me at Full Metal Packets. Happy to discuss all things cybersecurity. Now, you'll notice there is a QR code on the bottom left-hand side of this slide. If you're not already part of the SANS Offensive Operation Discord channel, that will help you join that channel. The reason that's extra important for this talk is after this talk, I'm going to release a challenge based on reverse engineering proprietary protocols in the Security 568 channel. The first person to solve that challenge and DM me, I have a $25 gift certificate to Starch Press, which you'll be awarded. So I didn't do it ahead of time so that there's a small chance you'll actually listen to me talk for 30 minutes, but I will release it as soon as the talk is over. So let's jump into it. What are we going to talk about? Proprietary protocols. In order to start there, I have to define that in some way, shape, or form. Easiest way to define it is what is the opposite? Open protocols. These are things that we're very familiar with, right? Protocols that there's an RFC for or a definition, somewhere that you can go look up and understand exactly what's happening by reading a document. These are things like HTTP, FTP, SSH, the list goes on and on and on. So proprietary protocols are vendor specific or application specific. We don't know how they work. And what's interesting is I have a picture on the slide here from internet, and we all know that the truth comes from the internet. And this company or marketing campaign is indicating that proprietary protocols are safer because they're unknown. Well, that sounds like security through obscurity to me, and I think we know as hackers or offensive security people in the room that unknown things work to our advantage, right? If the blue team or defenses don't know how something works, we can leverage that. So we're going to talk a little bit about today how to leverage that. A lot of what I'll talk about here will apply to both blue and red, but I'm going to focus on red today. So I've come up with a 8-step process to help reverse proprietary protocols. We go into this for about a day and a half in Security 568 if you're interested in this. I obviously don't have a day and a half right now, so we're not going to cover all 8 areas of this. We're going to do it in a bridge version. We're going to talk about 4 main areas, 4 main steps of this process. My goal in doing this is, in the short time that we have together, this should be enough information to get you started today if you want to start to look at dissecting unknown protocols on your network. So the very first step is arguably the most important step, and this is what I call simplifying the scope. This is potentially the least exciting step, but you will struggle to dissect proprietary protocols reverse engineer if you don't get this part right. So what do I mean about simplifying scope? At the end of the day, we're trying to take a very large data set. Oftentimes we have hundreds to thousands to 10,000s of packets in a protocol. We're trying to understand what they do. So ultimately, what we need is we need less data. So how do we get less data? And we can't just randomly pick less data. The data that we're picking needs to be statistically significant. So simplifying scope is the concept of how do we take a very large amount of packets, in this case, reduce that down to a representation that we can tangibly actually study and is relevant to the rest of the protocol. So this is what we're trying to accomplish when we're simplifying our scope. So I talk about doing this by grouping packets, and we want to make statistically relevant groups. And we can use several traits to help define what those groups are. So we're going to look at these five groups real quickly, and then we'll do an exercise together on putting it together. So protocols is one way. There are proprietary protocols out there that use multiple protocols to transmit to piggyback off of. So for example, you'll have TCP and UDP being leveraged in a proprietary protocol. Splitting those into different groups is one way to get started and shortening the amount of data that you have to look at. Another concept here is conversations or flows. If you're familiar with Wireshark and the concept of streams, sometimes a stream can be a group of packets that all have one method or one application of transmitting data, and a stream can be a representation of a larger group of packets. Often we can use port numbers. Destination ports specifically can be tied to a specific purpose or a specific type of packet. Think of it this way. If you have a server that's listening on multiple different ports, packets are going to different ports. Those are oftentimes parsed by different threads or different processes. What do we know about threads? They have a specific function. So oftentimes, if you group your packets by destination port, those packets will have a like syntax or a like form to them. We can use length. Payload lengths can sometimes dictate exactly, or can dictate different types of packets. Packets of similar length will have similar format. And lastly, we can use other similar traits or payloads within packets. Here's one example, and we'll dig into this here more a little bit in a few seconds, is you can actually do things like take the MD5 hash of payloads, and you'll notice sometimes in proprietary protocols, you'll have multiple of the exact same packet. Well, obviously, we don't need to analyze 4 of the same packet. We can look at 1 and understand that that's a statistical significant representation of the other packets. So these are the 5 grouping of packets, if you will, that we can use to start simplifying our scope. Now, there's multiple ways to do this. My co-author for 568, Ishmael Venezuela, likes to say you can read the matrix, which is like staring at a Wireshark capture. But the other thing we can do is we can use code or leverage code to help us do that. So let's take a look at this. This is a real proprietary protocol. It's just a screenshot of it on the screen. So what is contained, if we want to understand this, what are we working with? What do we have to deal with? This capture has 516 packets in about 188 seconds. That's roughly over 3 minutes. And to be truthful, that's not a lot of packets, right? That's actually a very small amount of data for 3 minutes going across the wire for one protocol. But the point stands. Who here has time to look at 516 packets in their daily job, right? I don't think with your red or the blue side, you just don't have that time. So how do we cut this down to something more reasonable? We use those grouping techniques that I talked about, and we can leverage code to make that even more efficient. So here is a function written in Jupyter notebooks in Python, combining Scapy and pandas to ingest a PCAP into a data frame. We can then use that data frame to do statistical analysis based on the grouping that I mentioned in the previous slide. So here's an example of, I said the first thing you can do is break down by protocol. So here's an example within, it's 4 lines of code, but technically it's 2 because there's 2 print statements there. In 2 lines of code, we can simply see what is the protocol distribution in this PCAP. So let's go ahead and apply that to the data set that I showed you a couple slides back of that proprietary protocol. So if we start by using the protocol distribution concept, it's actually a failure in this case, right? The entirety of this proprietary protocol rides over UDP, so that's not very helpful for us. So we need to move on to something else. Well, another thing I mentioned was destination ports. So here's a graph showing that all of the data, all 516 packets, are going to 4 different destination ports. Well, that starts to be interesting, right? If I was to take one packet from each one of these categories, does that represent the larger data set? And so therefore I can focus on those. But we want to try to combine as many traits as possible so that we have the most likelihood that we're looking at relevant data. So let's look at a few more. Length was another concept that I mentioned. Here, if we graph by length, we also see we have 4 groupings of length of this protocol. Now that's extra interesting because there was also 4 destination ports. So what if we combine the 2? Is there any overlap in here? And actually what we find is that a specific length is going to a specific port. Well, if that's the case, that's a really good indicator that if we look at one packet from each one of these groups, that we will be able to understand or dissect this packet in a relevant manner. But statistical significance or relevant is really important. So do we trust just one PCAP capture of this data? No, of course not. One capture, we could have all kinds of just anomalies or happenstance. So let's go ahead, because we do this in code with pandas, it's real easy to just run the same numbers with a different PCAP. So we want to make sure we take a second capture of the exact same scenario of the first capture, right? Obviously, you need to make sure you're comparing apples to apples. And in doing so, we can once again graph and see that our graphs look extremely similar. In fact, if you look up there, the biggest difference is the destination ports, two of them are different. And I won't dig into that too much right now, but conceptually, it's close enough. We're never going to get exactly the same, but seeing that we have a breakdown, and the most important thing is the correlation of length and destination port holds true. So what we just accomplished here in just a few lines of code is we started with 516 packets that was given to us in 188 seconds, and in just a few minutes, we got 4. We take one packet from each one of these groups. We analyze those packets using the rest of the steps that I'll talk about here in a minute. We are reassured that we are looking at something that is relevant. You have much better chance of successfully reverse engineering a protocol if you look at 4 packets instead of 516. So the next step in our 8-step process is a concept called embedded networking. By the way, outside of the first step here, simplifying scope, these other steps that I've outlined can be interchanged. I just like the order that I've put them in. I find it useful, but it doesn't matter if you look at the steps, you're like, well, why can't you do this one before that one? You probably can, right? This is just the flow that works for me in my workplace. So what is the concept of embedded networking? One of the things we see after analyzing tons of different proprietary protocols is it's very common for vendors to embed networking information in the payload of the packet. It's basically repeating what's already exists in the higher levels. So things like the Ethernet header or the IP header will have that packet that information re-put into the payload. I'm often asked why. I've never designed a proprietary protocol, so I don't have the exact answer why, but what I suspect is that at the application layer, that application doesn't have access to that lower level information, and they need to do something with it. It's part of how they're making decisions, so they re-embed it into the payload of the packet. Well, Wireshark actually is really good for helping us see this information. So here on the screen, you have one of those packets, and you can see I've highlighted the source address in the IP layer. And Wireshark will automatically highlight that in the hexadecimal view as well. So we've got 7E010101. Well, that helps us visually see, does that pattern exist anywhere else in the payload? And sure enough, if you just look, was it two lines down, you can see the pattern repeats itself. Now, does that guarantee that that's an IP address in the payload? Of course not. But if you see this happening over and over again, there's a really good chance that this is an IP address, and it's something very common that we see in proprietary protocols. And not just IP addresses, MAC addresses, port numbers, all of them can be found in the payload. And what you're attempting to do here as you reverse engineer the protocol is slowly chip away at understanding 1 or 2 bytes at a time. So anytime we can reduce the unknown, we've got to win, right? Because we start to understand how this protocol works. So here, if we take the 4 packets, so this is 1 packet for each one of the groups, and we apply the embedded networking concept here, we'll actually see that there's an IP address embedded in 3 of the 4 different packet types. And we're well on our way to starting to understand this proprietary protocol. So moving on to the next concept or one of the other concepts in reverse engineering proprietary protocols, I like to call it enumerate patterns or enumerating patterns. And this is probably one of the most important or core concepts here, which is the idea of we want to look for patterns in 2 ways. We want to look for patterns across our payload, so each payload, comparing payloads together, looking for patterns. But we also want to look for patterns in the larger scope of our PCAP or cross PCAPs. So let me show you what I mean by this. I'll give you an example. Here again, we have a proprietary protocol. Now, this has been filtered in Wireshark to show us just one type of the packet. Type, remember, we categorized by length, and we also categorized by destination port number. So this is the ones going to destination port 7000 and length of 88. And if we visually just inspect this PCAP, no fancy technical analysis here, we can kind of see there's a grouping happening, right? So you have an IP address of 126.1.1, and there's 4 packets from that IP address. Then we can see a grouping of there's 4 packets from another IP address. In this instance, the 1.1.1 is the server, and the 126.4.153.150 is the client. Now, we want to never stop trying to simplify our scope or reduce our data set. So once again here we see, well, we got a lot of packets in this type. We could pick one and analyze them, but there seems to be potentially some difference here in these packets. What if we apply one of our other methods? And one of the things I talked about was payload similarity. Well, we've already have the PCAP in a pandas data frame. So it's literally one line of code to determine if these payloads are absolutely identical. And lo and behold, what we find here is that grouping of 4 packets is actually the same payload for each one of those, which means what we're really interested in is what is the difference between the MD5s? Is it a small difference? Is it a big difference? Is every byte different, right? So what we can do here is we can take a representation, we can take one packet of that has different MD5 here, and we can start to study what the differences are. Well, why don't we start where we left off? So we already discovered that there's an embedded IP address in the packet. Nothing fancy here. I'm literally just going to start with the next byte. And so is the next byte the same or different in every packet? And what we come to find out is, as we move forward, the next couple bytes are actually identical across each one of these packets. But there is something that's different. It's the 4th byte. In the 4th byte, there's a change. Okay, well, in networking, you can have one byte that indicates something or represents a trait in a packet. It does happen. That's why Scapy has a byte field, for example. But the majority of the time, bytes are grouped together in 2, 4, or more increments. So likely when you see one byte changing, there's another byte or group of bytes paired with that, right? So if we think about this and we look at the difference here, we can see a pattern, right? We're enumerating patterns. So what's the pattern here? Well, there's a difference or an increment of 10, combining a little bit of hex and decimal math here, right? So we've got 47, 51, and 5B, and decimal, those are apart by 10. I don't know what that means, but I found that there's a pattern. So I have 2 ways I can look at this. I can continue to look at the payload itself and try to discern more information about what that 10 might represent. But remember, I said the other thing that's important to do is to look for patterns across the entire PCAP. So if we zoom back out for a second with the knowledge that there's a value in the payload that's changing by 10 and just examine the rest of the PCAP, we can actually see that there's something else very obviously changing by 10. And here it's the timestamps or when the packets were sent on the network. So we've got 106, 116, and 126. That begs the question, is this a coincidence? I don't personally believe in coincidences, right? Everything is connected in some way, shape, or form. So is the value that's changing in the packet by 10 connected to the timestamp that's changing in the larger PCAP? One way to test this theory out would be to take the 4 bytes, remember, why 4? Because I suspect this is a date timestamp is my suspicion. And that's not going to be just 1 byte, right? And we take that hexadecimal, we translate that using an online converter to epoch time. We get Tuesday, January 23rd, 2018 with 4:22 GMT time. Well, does that mean that's a timestamp? I mean, that could be a random fact, right? I could have just taken a random number and that happens to be the epoch time that got spit out. But if we take a closer examination at the frame of the packet was sent, Wireshark shows us something very interesting. It shows us that the arrival time of the packet was January 23rd, 2018, and the exact time is slightly different. Now, reverse engineering packets or reverse engineering general sometimes is more of an art than a science, right? Things are not always going to match up exactly, but this is dang close. And so the fact that this is close indicates to me that there's a good chance maybe the clock was off on the device sending this or some other difference here, but there's a good chance that this is actually a timestamp. So I just wanted to show you a little bit of how by looking at patterns across the payloads and then looking at patterns across the entire PCAP, of course, this is a crash course, right? You want to look at patterns across multiple PCAPs to make sure you're statistically relevant, but you're able to intuit different fields or different bytes within the packet. So let's jump to the last step that I want to talk about here today, and that's application reverse engineering. because I'm speaking to an offensive audience, right? There's often a lot of talent or a lot of experience in doing application reverse engineering, or maybe you've taken Steve's 660 class and got some experience that way. So can we use that to our advantage when we're looking at understanding network traffic? And the shorter answer is absolutely. If you have access to a binary that's either sending or receiving the proprietary protocol, it must understand what the traffic is. And so that's kind of like your Rosetta Stone. The challenge is, do we always have access to the binary? In our instance here, we were looking at the packets sending from 126.4, 153, 150. That's the client. In the case of this proprietary protocol, this client device is a medical device, and it's very difficult to get access to the binary. Is it impossible? No. We could use embedded reverse engineering techniques and take apart the hardware, pull off the firmware, try to get the binary, all that fun stuff. But it's definitely more challenging. And here we have the server 126.1.1.1, and this is a Windows machine. Well, that's easy to get the binaries from. So if we, for a moment, say that we didn't understand those time bytes, or we wanted to confirm those time bytes, we could do some reverse engineering on the Windows application. So if we take the binary that's sending this traffic, now a little bit of backstory here, the application running is a medical device using what's called the RWAT protocol. The IDA decompilation that you see on the screen here, I have not doctored up at all. Literally hit F5 and screenshot. We got lucky in this instance because symbols and debugging information was left in the binary. So we even have extra context clues that you may or may not have if you're doing this in your situation. But looking at this, we can see at the top of the decompiled function, we have a function called broadcast RWAT. And we know the protocol name is RWAT. And in this case, the traffic's being sent to the broadcast address. I don't know if you noticed that on the last PCAP or not. So this is a good indicator that we're kind of in the right direction. And by the way, this while loop is in the start function of the binary. So I didn't have to dig very far. This is just in the start loop. We know it's going to start broadcasting traffic. Other thing we can see is there's a variable name, RWAT period, that's being set equal to get RWAT period later in the function. And then the value of that is being printed out in some dlog log that indicates that the RWAT period is equal to X number of seconds. We can even go a step further, and we can look at the get RWAT period function. We have this variable called time config value, and that variable, depending on what it's set to, probably hard-coded or in some config file, if you were to continue this analysis here, it returns a decimal value, one of which is 10, right? And we know that there's a difference in time of 10 of those grouping of packets. So it's just a small taste on how you can use application reverse engineering to assist you in understanding what's in proprietary protocols. Obviously, if you don't have access to that, then you want to use some of the other techniques in the list. So lastly, I wanted to cover a little bit of how you can use this from an offensive operations perspective. How are threat actors using this from an offensive security perspective? There's three main things that we see with proprietary protocols: exfiltration, emulation, and falsification. So let's start with the first one, exfiltration. One of the things I didn't have time to talk about from a characteristic perspective is one of the things you see often in proprietary protocols is lots of padding. Lots and lots of padding. So here is the largest packet of the 4 types that we looked at earlier, and I've made it so it highlights all the null bytes. Null bytes are very commonly used for padding, not the only thing that's used for padding. It can be any byte whatsoever, but you see a lot of repeating bytes and a lot of padding. And so here, if it's null bytes, we can actually see early on in the packet, we have large strands of just padding, right? In this case, there's over 32 bytes of padding. I think if you do the math, it's like 36 here of continuous padding. And there's other places in these packets that have that padding as well. When we think about the mindset of exfiltration data, and this is a standard packet that you see all over your network, as from an offensive perspective, you can stuff data here and transport it all over the network. Do you one better? Because packets like this are rarely understood by the defense or by the blue team, you don't even have to do the rest of the packet correctly, right? All you have to do is look close enough. Maybe you have the destination port numbers correctly. Maybe you tack on the embedded networking that's in the top of the packet, and you put whatever you want in the rest of the packet, and you're not going to be detected by the sensors in the network because nobody's looking at this traffic. They don't understand it enough to look at this traffic. And you can do whatever it is you need to do on the network. The next thing I want to talk about is emulation. So there's a value sometimes in red team operations of people thinking that a system is working in such a way or pretending that there's a device on the network when there isn't. You can use that for misdirection, or you can use that to make it look like there's more systems on the network. And I want to show you what that might look like. In the case of the protocol that we were looking at here together, I said it's a medical protocol. So I'm going to use that as an example, but don't get hung up in the medical use case of these two examples. This is just the one I'm using. This can be thought about across all kinds of different industries. So here we have a Raspberry Pi loaded up with a script that knows how to talk that proprietary protocol. It's not a real medical device, but the server identifies it as a medical device, and we're able to spin up and send valid data to the server. Why? Because we understand how the proprietary protocol works. And now in this case, the system believes that there's a medical device sending medical information back to the server when it's just a Raspberry Pi on the network. I'm sure from a room of offensive-minded individuals, you can think about how to use this to your advantage. And again, don't get hung up on the fact that this is in the medical space, right? It could be used in a lot of different areas. So the last step I want to talk about is the concept of falsification. We hear and we talk about misinformation campaigns all the time in offensive security. How can we use proprietary protocols to leverage falsification? How are threat actors using it for falsification? I'm going to show you another video to demonstrate this here. And the way I'm demonstrating this again is with the medical protocol, but think outside the box here. This is a legitimate patient monitor sending information back to the server. And so this is actually the real information going back and being captured by the device. So in this case, we've got 80 beats per minute being sent over the wire. Well, if an attacker is on your network and understands this protocol with a simple Python script, they're able to change the data that's going across the network. So here, attacker spins up a escapee script, and all of a sudden that 80 beats per minute turns into 180 beats per minute. And this is being saved, in this case, to the server or to the database. And here you can see the mismatch, right? You can see the mismatch from the actual device. You can see the difference on the server. Now, there's obviously, in this very specific case, there's ramifications from a medical aspect. But again, think outside the box for a minute. You know, what if you wanted to make it look like an alarm was going off that shouldn't be going off, or you wanted it not to go off and you understood the proprietary protocol, right? Or you wanted to open a door, or et cetera, et cetera. Being able to manipulate that is highly to your advantage. So I hope you enjoyed my crash course in reversing proprietary protocols. Whatever time we have left, Steve, I'm happy to take questions. And don't forget about that challenge. I will drop that in the Discord as soon as I get off here and back to my computer. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. And if you do have questions for Doug, please go ahead and post them up in Discord in the questions for speakers channel. But yeah, I got a few questions here. Let me find them again. Where did they go? All right, how do you deal with encrypted network data when used by proprietary protocols such as like HVAC and alarms and other products?
Yeah, so encrypted protocols are always a challenge. We actually talk about this in Security 568. Assuming you have full access to the system in which you're doing analysis on, there's lots of different ways you can handle that, between man-in-the-middle attacks, between finding certificates, and you can put them into Wireshark. It's harder to do it from a black box perspective, but as long as you're doing your analysis from a white box perspective and you have access to the systems, usually you can find some way to decrypt them, either by finding keys or by doing some type of man-in-the-middle attack. That'd be my short answer.
Great. So what vertical markets do you find the most proprietary protocols? Example, healthcare, education.
I think I've seen them in healthcare, education, and in critical infrastructure. I think critical infrastructure probably is the largest one, medical being the second market that I've seen the most of them in. Yeah, I think those are probably the two biggest ones.
Great. So do you ever find yourself writing custom protocol parsers for a tool like Wireshark?
I've never personally written it for Wireshark. If you notice, one of the steps in that I put on the screen there is documentation by Scapy. And what I mean by that is, as you learn about how your protocol works, writing a custom Scapy layer for that to parse that protocol is extremely useful. You can use that for multiple applications. If you're on the red team side, it turns into a fuzzer really easily. Like Scapy has some ability to do fuzzing itself or to do some mutation. If you're on the blue team side, being able to take those Scapy layers and import into something like Bro or Sucata and make rules around them is extremely useful. So I typically use Scapy as a way to write a custom parser. I don't typically write Wireshark layers, but you could definitely do that.
Yeah, Scapy is an amazing tool for that. Next question was, I can't find it, but I remember what it was. It was around how important do you think it is for a company to have a group or an individual even who can do product security testing? Not only that, how do you justify it to management if it's something that you feel you should have in your organization? And finally, the third part of the question was, shouldn't we be able to trust these companies to test their own products before they ship them out? Why should we, the company, have to test another organization's products?
That was a lot of questions, Steve. I'll see if I can like navigate my way through answering
I can
all of
break it
them.
up.
So, should we have specialized teams to do this type of analysis? Absolutely. It's kind of the same old thing we've seen in security for a long time, right? Do we trust what's being released by the vendor? You know, the whole concept of you should trust that they've done their due diligence to a point, but you're really going to only understand the threats on your network if you understand the products you're using at a deep technical level. You level up your game as a defender if you can say, okay, I understand that the product's working in X, Y, or Z way, or I understand the protocol. Now my security tools that I pay lots of big money for, I can tune to the specific nature of the products in which I'm using. Otherwise, you're stuck using generic best practices when an incident occurs. Not that those things are bad, and we should all implement those generic best practices, but what you might not understand, and I could probably go on this forever, so you can shut me up at some point, but like, especially when we talk about things like supply chain attacks, right? If we use the famous log4j example, and yes, by the way, log4j, in my opinion, is considered a supply chain attack, right? You have an underlying library that had a vulnerability. Well, what was the biggest problem with log4j? It wasn't the vulnerability itself. It was answering this simple question, do I use it? Or where is it used, right? It didn't matter what defenses you had in place. The first thing you had to figure out was, do I use this library? Doing exercises like this and doing exercises like product security testing, you instantly have an answer to that question, right? You're instantly able to say, oh, I analyzed my product. I know it's using these libraries. Whatever the mitigation is, I can now implement that. So I don't know if I answered all of the questions, but I tried to hit most of them.
No, it's good. I always think back to this example. It's a bit embellished by this point, but Tavis Ormandy, if you know who he is at Project Zero at Google, there was years ago, they had the Naked Security blog at Sophos, and Ram Cluley was the individual who ran that. And he posted something up there that said, Tavis Ormandy, are you proud of yourself for releasing O-Days? And, just basically insulted him, and even said something like, I think someone needs a girlfriend. Like, when you insult one of the top hackers in the world, what do you think they're going to do? So he spent like the next few months of his life focused on Sophos antivirus, found over 10 0-days, released a talk and presentation at Black Hat that year called So Fail, then worked on So Fail 2, then he was working on So Fail 3, and then the CTO from Sophos got a job at Google and ended up being like, his boss was like, chill, bro, like it's cool. But it's amazing because Project Zero and Tavis specifically and other members there, like they find vulnerabilities all the time in products, especially security products. So another question came up here on Discord. Could this be used to spoof a patient's current state? Let's say they are actually no longer in their room, but the sensors think they are.
Absolutely. The little demo that I showed in this specific case, if you're asking about that protocol, the fact that it's unencrypted, all you have to do is understand how it works, and you can change blood pressure, you can change whether they're there or not. And that's the emulation piece, right? If you've got a Raspberry Pi or something on the network, patient could not be there and they're still sending vitals. So it's a very, very real possibility.
Yeah, last question here. Thinking these techniques work for understanding all traffic on the network, even for known protocols. Am I correct?
Absolutely. These techniques will work with any type of networking traffic. The reason I focus on unknown protocols is a lot of times it's a little extra work. If you can just go read the RFC, you don't need to do all this extra legwork. But there are instances where I've run into where the RFC is ambiguous, or there's some protocols that are a hybrid of open and proprietary. I'm drawing a blanket now. There's one ICS one that I used to work. It doesn't matter. I can't remember. But yeah, so there is a case to do this for known protocols.
Nice. And it makes me think of that. If you remember the researcher Barnaby Jack, who passed away, unfortunately, several years ago, right before he was about to do a talk at DEF CON or Black Hat, specifically on hacking insulin pumps and pacemakers and such, and just wild things that you're able to do. So again, thank you. Round of applause for Doug here. We'll move on.